She was dragged out of the church with her baby after her husband's funeral until a millionaire stepped in. The autumn rain fell softly against the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Church, casting colored shadows across the worn wooden pews filled with mourners. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her 3-month-old daughter Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms, both of them dressed in simple black clothing that had been purchased with the last of their savings. The casket before them held Michael Harrison, Sarah's husband of 2 years, taken far too soon by a heart attack at age 28. Sarah's eyes were dry now, having shed all her tears over the past 3 days. She felt hollow, numb, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold before her. The church was full of people she barely knew, Michael's co-workers from the construction company, neighbors from their small apartment building, and scattered. Throughout the pews, members of the wealthy Harrison family who had never acknowledged her existence until now. Michael had been estranged from his family since he was 18, when he chose love over money and walked away from the Harrison fortune to marry Sarah, a waitress from the wrong side of town. They had built a modest but happy life together, working hard to make ends meet, dreaming of the day when they could provide their daughter with everything they had never had. Now Michael was gone, and Sarah faced a future she couldn't begin to imagine navigating alone. The service was simple and beautiful. Father Williams, who had married Sarah and Michael in this very church, spoke with genuine warmth about Michael's character, his dedication to his young family, and his generous spirit. Despite having so little material wealth, several of Michael's construction co-workers shared memories of his humor and kindness, painting a picture of a man who had chosen happiness over riches and never regretted his decision. As the service concluded, Sarah remained seated, holding Emma close and trying to gather the strength to face the reception that would follow. People began filing past the casket to pay their respects, offering Sarah quiet condolences as they passed. She managed to nod and whisper thanks, though the words felt hollow in her throat. That's when she noticed the disturbance near the back of the church. A group of well-dressed people had gathered, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Sarah recognized them as Michael's family, his parents, Robert and Margaret Harrison, along with his older brother David and several other relatives she had only seen in photographs Michael kept hidden in a drawer. Margaret Harrison, an elegant woman in her 60s, wearing an expensive black dress and pearl necklace, approached Sarah with determined steps. Her face was set in lines of cold disapproval that Sarah recognized from their one brief meeting years ago when Margaret had tried to convince Michael to leave his pregnant wife. "Sarah," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone. Accustomed to being obeyed, "we need to discuss the arrangements." Sarah looked up, confused and still raw with grief. "What arrangements, Mrs. Harrison?" "For the burial, dear. Michael will be interred in the Harrison family plot as is proper. The reception will be held at the Harrison estate where it belongs." "I don't understand," Sarah said slowly, adjusting Emma in her arms as the baby began to stir. "Michael and I already made arrangements. He's being buried at Sunset Cemetery, and the reception is at the community center. It's all been paid for." Margaret's expression hardened. "Those arrangements are no longer suitable. Michael was a Harrison, despite his temporary lapse in judgment. He belongs with his family." "I was his family," Sarah said quietly but firmly. "Emma and I were his family." Robert Harrison stepped forward, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes that reminded Sarah painfully of Michael, though without any of the warmth that had made her fall in love with her husband. "Sarah, be reasonable," Robert said in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by even speaking to her. "You can't possibly afford a proper funeral. Let us handle this with the dignity Michael deserves." "Michael deserves to be buried where he wanted to be buried," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger despite her exhaustion. "He made his wishes very clear. He wanted nothing to do with your money or your family plot." The tension in the church was becoming palpable. Other mourners had stopped their conversations to watch the confrontation, and Father Williams moved closer, clearly concerned about the scene unfolding in his sanctuary. David Harrison, whom Sarah had never met but recognized from Michael's old photographs, stepped forward with an expression of barely contained anger. "Listen here," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly in the quiet church. "Michael may have made some poor choices in his life, but he was still a Harrison, and Harrisons are buried with dignity, not in some pauper's grave paid for by charity." "It wasn't charity," Sarah said, her own anger finally breaking through her grief. "We saved for months to make sure Michael would have a proper burial. Maybe it's not as expensive as what you could provide, but it was bought with love and sacrifice." Margaret moved closer, her voice dropping to a hiss that only Sarah could hear. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, dear. You're young, you'll remarry. But Michael belongs with his real family now." Sarah stood up abruptly, holding Emma protectively against her chest. "His real family? I was his wife. This is his daughter. We were the family he chose, the family he loved. The family he was trapped by," David said cruelly. "If you hadn't gotten pregnant, Michael would have come home where he belonged." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt tears threatening for the first time since the service began. Emma began to cry, sensing her mother's distress, and the sound echoed through the church like an accusation. "That's enough," Father Williams said firmly, stepping between Sarah and the Harrison family. "This is a house of God, and you will show respect for the grieving widow and her child." But Robert Harrison was not deterred. He nodded to David and another man Sarah didn't recognize, and suddenly they were moving toward her with clear intention. "If you won't be reasonable, we'll handle this ourselves," Robert said. "Michael is coming home, and you can follow or not as you choose." Before Sarah could react, David had grabbed her arm while the other man reached for Emma. "Don't make a scene," David hissed in her ear. "Just let this happen quietly." "Let go of me," Sarah said, trying to pull away while protecting Emma, who was now crying loudly. "You can't do this. I'm his wife. I have legal rights." "Rights that won't matter when you can't afford the lawyers to enforce them," Margaret said coldly. Other mourners were beginning to intervene, with several of Michael's co-workers stepping forward, but the Harrisons had the advantage of wealth and ruthless determination. Sarah found herself being physically moved toward the side door of the church, Emma crying in her arms while she struggled against David's grip. "Stop this immediately!" The voice cut through the chaos like a knife, carrying absolute authority. Everyone in the church turned to see a man in an expensive but understated black suit standing in the center aisle. He was tall and distinguished, probably in his 40s, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. Sarah had never seen him before, but something about him made the Harrison family freeze in place. "Who the hell are you?" Robert Harrison demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The stranger walked forward with measured steps, his gaze never leaving the Harrison family. "I'm Thomas Chen," he said quietly, "and the young woman you're assaulting is my daughter-in-law." Sarah gasped. She had heard Michael mention Sarah's family, successful relatives who had moved to the East Coast years ago. But she had never met any of them. Michael had lost touch with most of Sarah's extended family when they moved away. Thomas Chen continued speaking, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable threat. "Now, you're going to release my daughter-in-law and her child, and you're going to leave this church. Immediately." "Your daughter-in-law?" Margaret Harrison sputtered. "Sarah never mentioned any family." "Sarah's maiden name was Chen," Thomas replied smoothly. "She's the daughter of my late brother, and while she's too polite and too overwhelmed by grief to mention it, she's not without family or resources." David still held Sarah's arm, but his grip had loosened. "Even so, Michael was our—" "Michael made his choices," Thomas interrupted. He chose Sarah, he chose his daughter, and he chose to be buried according to his own wishes. Those wishes will be respected. Thomas pulled out his phone and made a brief call. Yes, this is Thomas Chen. I need security at St. Mary's Church immediately, and contact my attorney. We may need to discuss harassment charges. The effect was immediate. The Harrison family exchanged uncertain glances, clearly recognizing that they had underestimated their opposition. "This isn't over," Robert Harrison said as he backed away from Sarah. "Michael was our son, and Sarah was his wife," Thomas replied. "The wife he loved, the mother of his child, and the woman who will be buried beside him when her time comes, as he requested. Now leave, before I have you arrested for assault." As the Harrison family filed out of the church, Thomas approached Sarah gently. "I'm sorry for your loss, my dear," he said softly. "Michael was a good man who chose love over money. I respected him for that." Sarah stared at this stranger who claimed to be family. "I don't understand. Michael never mentioned—" "You're fat,"